Good day. Welcome to the Strong Ambition Podcast. Today, we're going to dive into training and nutrition with Mitch Calvert. You know, there's a lot of issues around social media these days. And so me and Mitch are going to dive into the problems within it. Now, Mitch has been on the show before. And if you haven't heard his episode, go back to episode 42. And Mitch came from being obese himself. And he said, I don't want to be a statistic. He says he remembers that day and it changed his life. He lost a ton of weight over many years. And so that's what we talk about in that episode, is all the ebbs and flows, all the challenges he had. And now he's a very successful online coach himself. He has over 200 people in his program and he helps people transform their lives all the time. And so ever since then, we've been friends and we talk about all these challenges around training and nutrition constantly when we hang out. And so I'm like, why don't we record this? Why don't we get this out there for the public? So we talk about the problems, especially around social media and the marketing around it and how challenging it is for people to navigate this, which also leads us into talking about the extreme dieting, the carnivores, the vegans, the fasting, and, cold plunges. Are all these things necessary? And we kind of try to clean up this information a lot more for you. Really cool topic is actually Ozempic. We dive into that because he has clients using it. And he's also used it himself. So we're going to talk about the good and the bad and the ugly about that. And a very important topic, which is what is healthy, because so many of us get this concept from the social media, is that jacked and lean is healthy, which it's not necessarily that way for everyone. And you'll really understand this when you appreciate when Mitch talks about his body composition, how it's much more body fat than you'd expect, but how healthy he really is on all of his other blood markers. His resting heart rate is incredible. And so we're going to give you a new definition of what healthy might be for you. And so it'll be very helpful. This whole conversation is for the everyday person that just wants to be fit and healthy, that just wants to live a longer life, a better quality of life. If you work all the time, you have a hard time fitting it in, but you really want to get better at these things, that's what this conversation is about, especially for people who have family. You can only do so much. So this is a really fun conversation, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. I will mention that I apologize for this being a little bit of a delayed episode. There was a little bit of an issue with how we're trying to change our platform hosts for the podcast. So there was a bit of a delay, but this episode is going to be a really fun one. I wanted to make sure we had a good one in stock for you. And now you're going to be able to catch this on YouTube and the video version on Spotify if you watch it on Spotify. So that's a really good plus of this shifting over to the new platform. And I also want to mention very quickly that as you're catching this, just in a few weeks, I'm going to be launching my program, the Metabolic Cookie Monster. And so I just want you to keep an eye on for that. The Metabolic Cookie Monster program is all about building your metabolism, eating cookies, and getting monster strong. So if you want to know more about that, keep an eye out for it, because this program will never be cheaper than it is the first week of September. So keep your ear to the ground for that. And let's dive into this, because this is going to be a really fun conversation. So without further ado, here is Mitch Calvert. Mitch, man, welcome back to the show. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well for Monday. No, Mondays are always good in self-employment, because you make your own hours, and it's a lot of hours, but it's your own hours, right? So that you understand the value in working for yourself.
Oh, yeah.
So Mondays are good in my world for the most part.
Yeah, it's that's why I like that you get your true break from the weekend, but then you have almost like this urgency, because your Monday matters so much. It's like, what's going on in my business? What's going on with my people? Whereas like when you're showing up to work and it's like, I've had the 9 to 5, done construction, all this stuff, you show up and it's just that Monday, right? And I haven't felt that feeling since I've been self-employed. There's the excitement. It's like, what do I get to do rather than what do I have to do? So I totally know what you mean. Yeah. Well, let's dive into what we want to talk about today. So, I'll in the intro talk a little bit about how, you're online trainer as myself. And, since our last chat on the podcast, we've gotten to know each other much better. And so we're now colleagues and friends, which is great. And we chat a lot about this stuff in person. So why not do it on air? The thing that I love to ask every online coach is, what's pissing you off about social media and fitness? So we can talk and rip about this constantly for the next hour. But let's talk about at least a few key points. What's ones that are really itching you right now?
Yeah, well, the extremes get attention, right? The algorithm favors the bold, the BS, and those people who make, proclamations that just frankly aren't really based in science or truth. So that's the frustrating part, is like being a coach with integrity, of showing up, preaching the basics and the principles that we all know and understand about weight loss and training. And yet most people understand those concepts. They don't want to hear it. They want to hear that beef tongue for breakfast is the secret, like a recent video I saw. And it's repulsive and disgusting, but it gets attention and eyeballs, and people want to believe there's a secret, right? I understand that. So that's my frustration with the fitness industry, is so much misinformation from people who, well, some might have good intentions. Others are kind of just trying to sell a secret solution, right? So it's kind of fighting that good fight and not getting caught up in fighting for attention, so to speak.
Well, and that's super important for people to hear, because hopefully they pay attention to it. Because if they're listening to our content, then they know that it's not about the bullshit, but why that bullshit's out there. So what you mentioned. And I will also put a caveat there. Like there's a reason why, especially the beef tongue, right? And I got caught up in this right when I started into online, was the carnivore diet. The thing that's valuable, now I always like to steel man the arguments from the other side, and that is that when you have something like the carnivore diet, I even make the case for the vegan diet, is that people go on this journey in some way that just transforms them. And so people, like, you'll know that person that lost so much weight on keto and they turned into a keto person for life. Now that's the important part. They found a form of restriction that works for them. The vegan that's like, hey, I finally lost weight. Well, they probably took a bunch of ground beef out of their diet. They got rid of fatty foods and they lowered their calorie intake. And all those people probably eventually hit plateaus. But if they decided to change their life that way, it's impactful. And the carnivore one is, I think, is extremely unique because it does resolve a lot of autoimmune issues in the process. So what people, get really amazed by is, like, there are forms of grains and carbs and even plants that some people can have a really hard time digesting and cause autoimmune flare-ups. That is such a small percentage of the population. The thing is how impactful it is to that percentage, right? And I will even say that there's this issue within all research, but especially nutrition, is that this subgroup of people cannot get the research in time to help them. So to me, the carnivore has some really good benefits to people. I talked to a guy recently that has Hashimoto's disease, and I'm aware that, like, that kind of a digestion issue and that kind of autoimmune reaction has great benefits in the carnivore diet. And what's funny, he came from a vegan diet. And so it's like, when he says he's all carnivore, I'm like, fuck, I get it. Like, I do. But I've even heard, a plant-based advocate, a vegan advocate, talk about how it's like, it can be used as an elimination style diet, but it should not be your long-term fix because of the health risks that are involved. It's a huge gamble, right? But as you mentioned, these people make these big transformations. They lose 100 pounds, 60 pounds, whatever. They feel like their skin is better. All this is better. And we don't know enough of where their initial starting point was. There's so many people who will say, oh yeah, I've done the calorie deficit. I've done it. But did you? Right. And I think a really good one that was hot topic was the Dana White transformation, right? Seeing his interview and seeing him talk about, oh, I've done it. It's like, what did you do? Because we don't know, right? And as we know, when it comes to research, it's like, well, we test this very tightly, a randomized controlled trial, right? This is this diet, this is this diet, and then you get to compare them a lot more, objectively, not just I did it. It's like, but did you, right? But when you have someone, who is the guy who was leading Dana White, the one of the best?
Yeah, Gary Breckan.
Gary Breckan. Yeah, the guy who just pulls magic out of his ass now, right?
Yeah.
But that's what he does so well. You talk about these new things, Gary Brecka, the 30-30-30, right? Okay, so which is Tim Ferriss's thing, 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking and 30 minutes of cardio. Those are just, just numbers, right? Like, if you had someone do that any time of the day, it's helpful, right? But you now created a regimen for people. But then what Gary Brecka says, he's like, I've never seen something strip fat off faster. It's like, well, that's a powerful statement, because if a person goes to binge eat at night, that 30-30-30 didn't do anything, right? And so it's it's when these people create these very strong narratives of absolutes that become so dangerous. Well, let's talk about a couple more. I want to hit some myths out there that you see relevant that aren't helpful. What's a few more that come to mind?
Well, yeah, I guess Gary Brecker's a good person to speak on because a excellent marketer. Obviously, he's teamed up with Grant Cardone, who's one of the master marketers of the 10X system.
I didn't know he was with Grant.
Yeah, Grant is a co-founder with his 10X health systems or whatever. So you have to take a bit of the information with a grain of salt, knowing that they're very good at what they do, selling a solution, a magic fix, right? But yeah, his beliefs that cold tubs, cold showers burn more calories per minute than anything else in the world. That quote was flying around there. I personally love my cold showers, but not to try to strip belly fat magically, right? It's more, we've already talked on this, but like the mental boost I get from it, kind of those happy chemicals that are flowing for a few hours afterwards is well worth it for me. But people are doing it, and I have to kind of often talk to my clients and, well, this burns calories, right? I'm like, probably nothing that's going to move the needle more than just cutting out that coffee creamer that you're using, right?
Or go for a walk.
Yeah. Oh, the walk. Yeah. The default answer should be just go for a walk, right?
Right.
I mean, honestly, it's accessible to all of us.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing is like, okay, so how much is a cold plunge even cost and all that stuff, right? Or you try to, and if you dare to try to set that up in your own tub, that's a 20-minute expedition. You fill up I did it. I finally did this, filled up the tub. And the actual rush of feeling the cold tub after is like, man, okay, one day I'd probably consider getting a cold tub because you feel amazing after. It is mental, it's cognitive boost that you get. And even cognitive like discipline, like the challenge of doing something very uncomfortable. Yeah. Those are the two biggest benefits. But then that took me 45 minutes to do the whole thing. And I mean, I did several bursts, but I'm like, wow, okay, 45-minute walk definitely would burn more calories, right? And that's like the tangible thing that you'll do every day that you should do every day. It's these simple notions don't get the headlines, like you say. It doesn't really help people. And then it also, sometimes it's like, some people will look at it, there's two real negatives to this. Some people will look at it as like, that's so different, I have to do it, and that's what I'm missing. Or that's so hard, I don't think I can do this fitness stuff. And so it hits both people in a negative sense. Is you have people that are willing to do it, and then I'll hear other people, like family members, being like, yeah, I just couldn't do those cold showers. Like, you don't have to. Like, I mean, it's just really not the most important thing that you do today. If someone that you have as a client that has a lot of the other things, but maybe needs a little extra mental discipline or enjoys the mental discipline of doing things that are different, you know, I got a boxer, an athlete and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, cold shower yourself, work on controlling your breathing in a high stress state, cognitive benefit. I'm all for that. But when it comes to weight loss, we're not going to save ourselves. And probably one of the least favorite ones, which luckily didn't get a ton of mainstream attention when Huberman talked about it, but he had this whole fat loss podcast on one day. At no point at the start of the podcast did he say calorie deficit. I didn't hear him say it once, but he just talked about burning calories in different ways. And some of them were interesting, like it makes you pay attention to NEAT and how non-exercise activity is so just spontaneous for people. When they did this calf measurement, when they had people exercise just bouncing their calf throughout the day, and it was a significant amount of calories. Now that's not practical in terms of, hey, so did you do your calf bumps today? And it's like, no, that's not practical. It's insightful. It's like, okay, you want to know why the person at the office that's really lean, that doesn't like look like they work hard, it's because they just do get a genetic thing, or they're going to move around, they're going to fidget more, right? So this is where we say, hey, you're not that person, then you got to track your steps, because that's the best way we can regulate your NEAT. And his one comment, or his one idea, was the shiver from getting out of a cold shower or something like that. Believe it or not, I tried it after. I'm like, this sucks. Like, just to try to stimulate a shiver. This is, and it's like, how many calories should I be burning right now? This is so stupid. So more practical tips are just more useful, but they don't shine the headlines right. You got a couple more. Let's hit a couple more.
Yeah, I mean, the last one that really comes to mind is like the natural alternatives to Ozempic. I know we might get to that topic today, but like the Ozempic, there was berberine, which is like an over-the-counter supplement. Everyone's trying to kind of hack what Ozempic does in natural ways, but you can't duplicate the effects of an injectable peptide that elevates your levels of GLP-1 for probably the better part of the week, I think. Yeah, it's once a week. Whereas the Ozempic probably elevates your GLP-1 for a few hours afterwards, then you're back to baseline, right?
Yeah.
So those things, good intention, I suppose, but they can be super misleading for people, right? It's promising way too much.
I love the Ozempic because how from the carnivore community, oats got under attack, right? And it's like, but then people are like, Ozempic. It's like, yeah, oats can actually be great for getting rid of your appetite. Yeah, that's a good idea, but don't call it a drug. Just call it a very healthy food. You know what else does that? Most fruits and vegetables, right? You want to eat 200 grams worth of strawberries in the morning, see where your appetite is later in the day. It's a low glycemic carb, and you're going to get more vitamin C than you get in an orange. And it's just like the other one was when people were trying to say, and again, I know I'm a big fan of meat, but some of the things carnivores say, even though I came from that community, it annoys me. Eating high protein and meat is what Ozempic does. Like, no. Go take Ozempic and tell me it does. Go take it. Go take it. Because don't get me wrong, it's a high satiety food. But what you're really doing is you're eliminating all the other good tasting foods. The satiety effect that meat has is largely connected, in my opinion, to just palate fatigue. Like, I love steak. And if the only thing I was eating all day was steak, I would get palate fatigue because it's tasting the exact same way. As soon as you introduce other foods on the plate, it's, oh yeah, I got room for that. When I have steak and potatoes, I got some room for potatoes. And that's what actually makes the whole meal calorie dense, right? When you look at the protein to calorie ratio of like a typical ribeye, it's around 30% protein, right? Which means very high fat. Yeah. But if you were to just have the appropriate size of the ribeye and maybe a little bit of vegetables, you wouldn't even be terribly off your calories. Ideally not finishing the steak because it's very calorie dense. But then we have the twice baked potato, right? Or people are having hors d'oeuvres with it and they're having the wine with it. And it's like, well, now it's no longer the good protein calorie ratio, right? And so that's where we go wrong. But the idea that meat is as powerful as a drug is just like, I love that you're trying to support people to eat more meat. That's what I actually appreciated the most about the carnivore community was like, when I did do it, I did find that I wouldn't think about food as much because the other foods weren't an option. But that's what all restrictive dieting does, right? So, I mean, you were down the keto rabbit hole at one point, correct?
Yeah, and it certainly suppressed appetite. Where I was challenged is like getting enough fiber in my diet. And I had like some spare details, bowel obstructions, right? Irregular bowel movements, even ended up in the ER one day because I've gone 3 or 4 days without going. So that was the challenge for me. I know some people have rectified that in some ways of late. And that's the problem with this stuff is, right, there's no black and white. It's plenty of shades of gray. When it comes to nutrition in particular, I think training is a little more cut and dry. Like this is probably the most effective way. But diet, because individual responses, like you said, some people can go on carnivore and it cures up their joint pain and they feel great. By all means, keep doing it in that case. But then you've got others. Paul Saladino, the carnivore MD himself, went off of carnivore, right? Because it was having a negative effect on some of his blood markers. So he reintroduced fruit and honey or whatever he talks about, right? So yeah, it's tough to come up with conclusive statements, which is why I hate content that just says this is the only way and everything else is crap. You know, the Liver Kings of the world. So
the Liver King, yeah. And man, I've said this before. It's like if the Liver King could have just started admitting he wasn't natty, he still would have had a good following. Like there's plenty of people who aren't natty who are still telling you how to eat well and you'll listen to, but the lie is what really dug him a grave, right? And it's incredible. And yeah, Saladino, I actually, it's so funny because I give him credit, but it is where he loses credibility, is that because he speaks too much in absolutes. But I give him credit that he's evolving who he is.
Yes.
And so some people will criticize him for him, like, see, he's changing. It's like, you should too. Like, I mean, my diet's changing. I'm still optimizing. I think whenever another guy, I've got to remember his name now, but he's like, oh, we've always done the same thing. And I'm not saying that he has a bad diet. I'm just saying, like, maybe there's new research and maybe you should be trying to evolve your understanding because micronutrients are very complicated. Even Stan Efferding, who's a great guy in this community, he's probably he's the best crossover bodybuilder and powerlifter, where he would do powerlifting meets, break records, go to bodybuilding, crush it, and very science-driven guy. And he's like, he's also been a big part of, or like tied to the carnivore community, but he's also smart enough to say seed oils are not toxic. He actually came back on his own notion, where he said because they're so toxic to him, he has his own thing, but he'd be like, the research doesn't support it. Right. And for when someone can actually evolve their perspective. And again, Paul did, he's like, he went from raw vegan, had his issues, and then he's like, hey, this resolves something big for me. And once in a while, you'll catch him with these clips that he'll post, and he's like, I found my way. It's like, just start saying that. Stop talking in absolutes and saying that, like, this is absolutely the best diet for all humans. If he was spouting, like, this is why this diet works for me more often, I would garner way more respect for him. But he talks too much in absolutes, too much in extremes. And now it's like, especially when you get into microplastics, he was talking about aluminum. He was talking about the aluminum issue. And I'm just like, geez, like, we got to live our lives, man. Right? Like,
yeah. Going after Lululemon, man. Come on. You can't do that. My balls are okay in those pants.
Yes. I remember hearing about that. Tight underwear. I will say that I actually appreciated his idea of not putting a laptop on your lap. And I thought that was actually good insight, because I was doing that a lot. And I'm like, okay, yeah, there could be something there. And even like cell phones. This is actually one of my biggest things that I think is funny when people come after diet drinks, because diet drinks, sweetened sugar beverages, all of them get, or non-caloric sweet beverages. It's like, oh, it's got to be bad for you, right? There's just this absolute extreme. And every single one of these people are making this argument on a cell phone. And so I'm just like, okay, we're going to play this game. A, where's your proof? Do you have proof? And B, there's more proof that your cell phone is doing you harm. So are you sure you want to make that comment right now on that cell phone? Because there is some evidence to suggest that's going to lower your sperm count if you keep it in your pocket over a long period of time. And it's even it places a higher carcinogenic possibility than aspartame. Right now, aspartame is like, we don't know. And the cell phone is a little bit above that. It's like, oh, it could be. And so like, we're really critical of all these things, delivering it on a cell phone.
Yes, very hypocritical in a lot of cases. Like, aspartame is there with like pickled vegetables and aloe vera on the group 2B list, carcinogens, right? And cell phones is above them, which is hilarious. Yeah, people are willing to make enemies of certain things and, make friends with things that are probably more of an enemy than anything. However, we do need it, but it probably shouldn't be tucked against your private parts in your pocket. No reason to, just in case there's potential.
Keep it a safe distance. And it's like, I mean, I understand carrying it with you when you're going places, but it's a good instinct to take it out of your pocket for that reason. Every time I bring this up, you usually see someone take it out of their pocket, because it's just an instinct that you forget that it's in your pocket, right? So let's hit a couple more here, because I'm curious, even from your more client's perspective, I think this would be helpful, because then we're getting insight, not just from what we see, but what they see. What are some real big misconceptions that people have around, it could be food or training, that we should probably clear up on here?
Yeah, well, a big one is still like timing the meals. Like, oh, you can't have carbs after 8 p.m. or eat period after 8 p.m. because it gets stored as fat. Like some fairy comes by and dusts all the calories you consume after that time as body fat. It simply doesn't result in that. If you're in a calorie deficit, meal timing is probably a fairly low down the list of priorities, right? So that one comes up a lot. Like, oh, I don't know if I can eat when I get home or after my workout. I'm like, it's fine as long as you don't eat something too heavy that, comes back up or disrupts your sleep, right? So there's that. In terms of training, like the obsession with how much calories they burned, I think that's brought on by, maybe they've done Orange Theory or a boot camp of some kind in the past, and it's been so fixated on heart rate zones and calories burned, and we know that doesn't have a huge role to play in someone's success or failure. So those are the big two that jump out, I think. I'm sure more would come to mind if I was tasked to look it up. But
the food timing is great because that hits two things. You talked about bedtime, but people are now obsessed with skipping breakfast. So it's just intermittent fasting, right? So now we're so worried about food timing that it becomes a thing that, man, you talk about like these religious beliefs when it comes to different food disciplines, and it'd be so helpful. People say it works for me because, and it's a simple way of restricting. So when people try to, and it comes up a lot where people will talk about the value of intermittent fasting and saying, well, it's, to help repair my DNA, cellular damage and all that stuff. So they're talking about autophagy, right? Yeah, talking about programmed cell death that happens in the course of a fast. But what they don't know is it's identical to a calorie deficit. And it's brought on by the deficit of calories. That's what causes the cell program death. And so this was the big thing too with Brecka, right? Because when he did it with Dana White, he had him do a 5-day fast. I still have clients and friends that will talk to me about, I do like a few day fast and stuff. I'm like, you're a binge eater. Like, let's not support this idea of extremes as the solution, right? And it's so much harder to do something simple and consistent. Like, it's just so much harder, right? And when it's actually easier mentally to say, just don't eat food than just eat the right amount of food. It's way easier to say, don't eat any of these types of foods and saying you can have a little bit of them. It's walking a line rather than just, walking between walls, because walking between walls is very directive, right? And so, yeah, the intermittent fasting one is big. And so people understand that when it doesn't matter if you have an 8-hour window, 2-hour window, 1-hour window, your calories are your calories, right? And to actually, I think, somewhat defend the people who get caught up in the calorie burning is because we talk so much about calories on the nutritional end, right? So it becomes misguiding where it is calories in, calories out. And the thing is that the move more, eat less notion isn't inherently wrong, but it's not helpful, right? We're at a point where it's not helpful because that's what people will do without measuring it, right? So we do want you to move more, but it should be move more, move strong, and eat the right amount. It's not even like eat less. It's like eat the right amount, because so many people will eat very little during the day, then eat a ton at night, or they'll eat very little during the week, eat a ton on the weekend, or they'll eat not much for like a month and then eat a ton for a month. And so just eating less and moving more doesn't really solve the equation. But that's why they're looking at those calorie trackers, right? They're looking at, well, I got to move more, right? I got to move more. And so whenever a client does that, I'm like, you know what? You can look at those, because if it's supporting you to work hard, that's awesome. Call them hard working points, not calories. It's like if you did a high intensity interval workout, one day you burn this many, and the other day you burn this many, you're going to feel like, hey, that was a good workout. That's awesome. I'm not going to take that away. Just don't take that to the kitchen, right? And as long as they know that's what the notion is, it's like, these are the calories I burnt, and it showed me how hard I worked relative to other days. That's useful. But it's not useful as far as calorie per calorie that you're consuming, because your body's going to equate it. And that's what a lot of people don't know, is that when you work really hard in the gym, that's where the non-exercise activity gets compensated. You're not going to fidget as much. It's crazy to know how impactful. Have you heard how big of a difference non-exercise activity rates are from person to person?
Massive range. Yeah, they've done studies of people where they overfed them by 1,000 calories, and they would assume everyone would gain X amount of weight or between a tight window, and some didn't gain a pound because they compensated with a lot more activity or had a job that was conducive to that, while others would gain the anticipated 8 kgs or whatever over time. So yeah, it works both ways, right? In weight loss too, some people just naturally seem to move slower or move less as they reduce calories, and others continue to keep their activity levels high. So you have to force it if you're in that other camp, right? You've got to hit your step goal and try to compensate with consistent movement throughout. Well, you sort of touched on it, the body it's a complex machine, and you push it too far and it'll ramp up appetite without even realizing it. So you eat and make up the difference in any sort of calories you burned in addition to that exercise. So that's why it's a delicate balance between activity and eating enough and trying to lose that appropriate amount week to week. month to month, right?
Absolutely. Delicate balance is a good way to say it. It's a balance, and it is relatively delicate. I'd be curious too, and this is a question I've just had in general when clients are just doing more of the step count thing, which is what they should do. But it's fascinating to see how adaptive the metabolism can be. So generally speaking, and this is general, it's not absolute, that when someone easily puts on weight, right? They've had a hard time with weight loss over the years. They probably have an adaptive metabolism. Like they probably do, right? And it's not always, but if you see them training, you see them trying to eat pretty well, but it's just slow going, it's probably because you're on that side of things. You have a slow non-exercise activity and your step count would need to be higher. But what I've seen from even some clients that do the step count, do the calorie deficit, it's amazing to see that the calorie equation doesn't even benefit the step count that much. Like it does a bit, but I'd be curious if you see this, because the notion is at least above 7 to 8K, right? When we're looking at all-cause mortality, that's the number. And so some people I don't like it when people push against the 10K, because it's like that 10K number was just an arbitrary number, whatever. But it's still fucking useful. And I would even argue that the all-cause mortality idea is a useful insight for the trend that you want to be on. But I would just be willing to bet, don't have a ton of research, just be willing to bet based on what I've seen, is that the 10K average is a good metabolically healthy number. And we're going to see that trend even more for the all-cause mortality in the next 10 years or 20, 30 years, because we're going to see really the effect of what sedentary is doing. Because all of these trends in all-cause mortality, the people would have had to have died in the last 10 to 20 years for the research, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we're looking at trends for all-cause mortality, all of those trends will be shifting to some degree, right? They would have to, because life is different for the last 10 to 20 years, and the deaths are going to happen differently in the next 10 to 20 years. And my prediction is that the 10K step is a really good, consistent number for metabolic health. Because I think I remember hearing, and I have to look at it, could be somewhere around 50 to 75 calories per 1,000 steps, right? Depending on your body weight and size and the intensity. So that 7 to 10K even does make a little bit more of an impact when someone doesn't step enough. And I guess I wanted to come back to the original thought. Do you ever see people stepping almost too much? And do you think there's too high of a step count for people to try to attain and consistently do?
Yeah, which is why we tend to fall back on that 8 to 10,000 steps. It's not usually the first thing we look at if someone hits a plateau is, okay, let's get you up to 12 to 15,000, because it tends to be too difficult a number. And, especially if they're not a roofer, they're sitting at a desk all day. To build in that much exercise is a big commitment and something people can't generally sustain for too long. So we also find at a certain point, steps do have an impact on hunger. More so, it depends on the client. Some don't. But some who ramp up activity to that level, that 12, 15,000 plus, just eat back the difference.
Right.
So we tend to fall back to the 8 to 10,000. Let's adjust nutrition first, or time our carbs better, or whatever the case may be. Maybe a bit more strength work, but a last resort would be increasing the step count to that level. I know it works for some, but if I look back at the members we've done it with, which is not a huge sample size, we found it didn't have the anticipated impact, because we found they were eating back a bit of the difference because they got kind of ravenous, just like you will from a lot of exercise, high intensity in shorter bursts. But that much lower intensity exercise tended to lead to that outcome, right?
Yeah, so, even if it's low intensity, it's still just activity. And the good thing is, if we're comparing at least like the traditional, do more cardio, because that's what the cardio goal is, more output, right? Mm-hmm. But at least with the traditional cardio, and I did this in my prep, was the step count is so low intensity, it's going to be predominantly utilizing fat stores, right? So you're not going to be depleting your muscle glycogen when you're strength training for bodybuilding 5 days, 6 days a week. Those carbs are precious because you're having low carbs. Now, and even for a client that does, have a calorie reduction, you're going to have some carbs, but it's just, to me, and I haven't looked into the research on this, but most likely when you have lower glycogen stores, you could increase your appetite, right? And if you're doing cardio in the morning, then maybe they're getting you to do training at some point. Those are 2 like intentional exercise bursts a day that I could see stimulating appetite. And there's no question it works for fat loss, but it's not sustainable. Yeah. And that's where people haven't revved up appetite. So the step count is effective to, like you say, to a point where it's like, hey, we're still depleting. We're still really tired. You're almost creating too much of a separation between what you're, essentially just the amount of output you have and the amount of calories you're taking in. If there's just too big of a deficit that you're trying to create, the body's like, well, we just can't sustain that level of a deficit, right? So there's some sort of, the adaptive process is fascinating to me, because what I've seen with clients that are getting 15, 17K steps a day, and they're eating what should be like, well, according to that, with your output, you should be at like 1,000 calorie deficit. Yeah. It's not the deficit. It's not the deficit you predict, which means that your body is so adaptive, even though you're doing a bunch. It's like there's that sweet zone, is what we had just mentioned. It's like you want to move the right amount, you want to lift heavy and eat the right amount, because if there's just too much of a net deficit, it's still adaptive and it's still counterproductive to people, right? So I think that's really fascinating. Let's talk about the other major thing that we said is hot topic of Ozempic. And this is great because you have some clients, I believe, on it, and you've done it yourself. So why don't we talk about it? Introduce the topic a little bit for people who aren't familiar with the GLP-1 agonist.
Yeah, well, I think it's a breakthrough in science that'll work for the right person. And it will continue and evolve. Like there's third generations of these drugs now coming out, triple agonists. It's not like readily available even as a prescription yet, but I think it's in phase 3 trials, which is pretty much the last step between, okay, now we're okay to mass market this. Retatrutide is the one. We'll get back to that in a sec, but it has value for the right person. And I was, like yourself, 260 pounds for better part of a decade, frankly. So I can relate to clients that really struggle with the hunger piece. Whereas as soon as they go into a deficit, there's these, constant food noise in their head, cravings. And then we'll have clients that maybe haven't been quite so overweight, or just biologically, they're wired differently and they can adhere to a deficit without much trouble. They find it's difficult to eat all the food we ask them because protein's satiating for them. But there's 2 different camps there for sure. And I certainly fall into the camp where hunger is my biggest battle when it comes to adhering to a deficit. So that's where these GLP-1 agonists come in. Ozempic's the first generation. Semaglutide would be, I guess, the scientific term for it. But people take it once a week. Best form is just a little injection like an insulin needle, and it elevates your GLP-1 levels for the better part of a week, which basically slows the digestion of food, increases insulin, suppresses appetite, essentially, right? So that it just is that ancillary tool people use to better adhere to a plan. They still got to work out. They should certainly strength train, or they're going to lose significant chunks of muscle, and then adhere to their nutrition plan a lot easier that way, right? So that's the role it plays. Some people get side effects initially. Every time they maybe titrate up the dose, they might get some diarrhea or the opposite effect. I didn't have any of those, but I did get, and it's a fairly small subset of the population seems to get this, but I just couldn't turn my brain off. I was like having trouble sleeping from it. And I'm kind of prone to that. So it was something I discontinued within 2 shots. Right? I never really gave it a fair chance because of that. But we do have clients who've been on it for, in one case, over a year and lost 70 pounds. And it's certainly played a role in adhering to the plan. And, she was in the obese category and tried a lot in the past, didn't have much results. So it made sense to at least experiment with this and see if it worked for her.
Well, that's incredible. And I think that those stories don't get enough appreciation. Like the fitness industry is very critical of it, from like influencers and all that stuff. Like you get these people who are just like the hard-nosed, hardline people. And I just believe, and this is kind of my maybe personal bias, but I don't think you have enough overweight hard workers in your life if you believe that it's all just about hard work. And I have many hard workers that are overweight that just crush it in the business that they do. And I even see some of them working hard in fitness and nutrition. They're actually doing the training and stuff, and it's still fucking hard because they still have families. They still have shit that they're doing. And it's like, man, if that person said to me, and they haven't, but if they said to me, do you think this is something I should consider? I would, because you're clearly doing all the other stuff. It is just that hard to sustain deficits over a long period of time when you have so many other stresses in your life. You know, the fact that we finally do have the weight loss drug, or we're on the path of a really promising future for this, I do think is great. Now, I mean, the challenge is when it gets like dicey, like should everyone use this? It's like, no. And it's like when the celebrities are using it and they shouldn't be, that's a problem, right? But then this even raises a philosophical, you know, kind of, I think, kind of discussion of like, these things are going to evolve, right? It's like the first ChatGPT. It's like the first iPhone. Actually, I've heard people talk about comparing it to the iPhone and what it's going to do to the industry. And I would actually be on support with that because of how big of an impact iPhones made for communication, like just smartphones made for communication. The impact this will have on the fitness industry will be substantial, because maybe one day this won't be just a prescribed thing. Like, I mean, they're going to get better and better and better. No, this could be a bit of an asymptote, meaning like, you know, the line gets close, but it's never perfect, right? It's never actually going to be no downsides, no side effects, all that stuff. But I pose you this question because, so for clients, we always like, if it's the right client, they're having a hard time, they're obese, those are generally the people that you're going to recommend it to, that if they wanted to try it, I would give them the shot to experiment with it. As you mentioned, you're going to have less of an appetite. So you need to make sure what you are eating is super nutritious, right? Because it's like, you can't just eat shitty food and then less shitty food, because then you're not going to get any nutrients, right? You got to you got to get your protein, all these things, right? And you still got to strength train, because if you're just in a calorie deficit, you're going to lose muscle. So we would guide people on that. But I'd be curious from your perspective, and because you and I are similar, as you mentioned, we're like, food is still a focus for us. Like to this day, like we've always battled appetite. And what's super ironic about those who have this high non-exercise activity very commonly don't have appetites like we do, right? These are the hard gainers. When they're talking about, oh yeah, bulking stars, like, I don't know what the fuck that feels like. I have no idea what hard bulks feel like. I know what bulking feels like because it's just a liberty of my diet, right?
Yeah.
So would you ever consider if there was maybe no side effects for you? And this is just a question I've always asked myself since they came out, like, would I take it? And because that's where it becomes philosophical for us as trainers, is like, you know, I've heard Dr. Mike Gisertel talk about, like, then you could just work on other things. You don't have to think about that problem, right?
Yeah.
Where's your stance on it? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I experimented with in the first place, because I had done enough research, I'd seen clients do it, and felt like, well, let's give this a shot and see if it takes that edge off that I usually experience when I diet. I can be fine maintaining bulking, as you say. That's super simple for me.
Yeah.
But fat loss has always been the more difficult challenge, and constant cravings and trying to pry myself away from the pantry. So I thought, hey, let's give this a shot for that purpose. And if I had no side effects on it, I likely would have, you know, I wouldn't have run it ad nauseum, but for the period of 12, 16 weeks over a fat loss phase, like I went down to 189 pounds last year without it. And that was a real battle at the end. I'm still 14, 15% body fat at that number. So where I maintain is usually hugging up against 20%, and I can feel I'm not starving each day, and I can maintain that pretty easily. But to get further and further lower and lower down, it becomes a real grind and battle mentally. So I thought, okay, this is the perfect ancillary piece to help with that process. And certainly if there was newer versions that had less side effects, I would not be opposed to doing it. Just like a toilet versus an outhouse, or a speedboat versus the paddle boat. Like, if there's an easier path, it shouldn't be above taking it. I wouldn't call it cheating if you're not in a competing industry where you're not allowed to take something, right? I get that. But if it's you versus you want to make the process a little smoother, that's where this might have a place for some, right?
Well, I love that you went right to, like, basically modern day inventions that we don't look at being as cheating. They're just progression. And that's the way some of us can look at it. Some people are just so hard-lined on, like, the naturalistic fallacy of thinking if it's not natural, it's not hard work, you know, you didn't earn it. I have heard some good arguments around, like, you got to be careful when people are just looking for the easy route, right? That's where these things are actually going to be dangerous, because they are going to be just eating junk food and less of it. and they're not going to be healthy, they're not going to be training, but they're going to get leaner, right? Like there's going to be negative consequences to this reaction, no different than the cell phone actually does cause problems, right? Because people spend their lives on their cell phones, and more, social media, and more depression, and all these other things come from it. I think the net positive will be there. Mm-hmm. And again, like, I think I want to experiment with these drugs one day, but I'm still also, I think, a healthy skeptic on pharmaceuticals. It's just like, it's, even though it goes through the stages, it goes through, but then like a mass tells you a bit more, right? So they'll have so many test subjects. So usually my understanding is it takes like 10 years for drugs to get through a lot of the time. But then, like, okay, let's hear about the mass stories, right? Give that like 3 to 4, maybe 5, 10 years personally, because I don't need it. Now, if someone needs something now, they're obese now, they're diabetic now, yes, let's get them that drug. But for myself personally, I would give it some time. I was curious, how did you end up even getting hooked up with it? Because doesn't it have to be a prescription? Did you get your doctor to sign off on that?
No, it wasn't the doctor. Yeah, there's compounding agencies. So you may have seen ads, myrocky.ca. And as long as you answer the questions how they need to be answered, so a little bit, I shouldn't be sharing this in public space, but then they're happy to mail it out to you. Just like anything, right? You can probably get steroids online in a similar fashion if you know where to look. Right. And that's reality. So a bit of a gray area in the marketplace where these companies live, and they prescribe Viagra and TRT for guys that probably shouldn't be getting TRT. I'm not bullish on those. I think it should certainly be through a doctor, and you should have a certain BMI or metabolic markers that warrant using it at this point, at least. But at the same time, I mean, my aunt was on this 6-7 years ago, right? Ozempic's been around as a diabetic drug for the purpose of managing blood sugar. They only later discovered that, this has a really good appetite suppressant effect. It could be more for that purpose. So there's a pretty good amount of data supporting it, and there has been some side effects, right? I think there was a small signal for thyroid cancer in those with pre-existing conditions or something. So no free lunch, but by all standards, it's a peptide that kind of naturally raises your GLP-1. It's not a real mass human pharmaceutical, right? So I think, there's you're smart to kind of wait, see what comes of it. But I felt like there was enough there to safely use it in moderation, right?
Yeah. And I think so. The other major thing that will keep me away from it is the next topic is like, I'm already pretty lean. Like, why I would only use it for curiosity of like, what does it feel like for the sake of clients? I would do it for that experiment, but I don't see me getting to a body fat percentage that I can't control my appetite. Every year I'm continuously trying to evolve it, as I mentioned, evolving your diet and understanding around it. But the thing with, just looking at the health industry or the fitness industry, what is healthy? What is a healthy body weight and stuff like that? I think, as you just led to, which is so valuable for people to appreciate. I mean, you're a very successful trainer. You help a ton of people change their lives, like in a healthy way, and you're 20% body fat. That is, like, for people who are tied to social media would think that's ridiculous, right? Like, that can't be healthy. So, it is. Like, a healthy body fat percentage is super relative to how you're spending your life, right? Now, you can have someone who's 20% body fat and they are not training. They're eating a very unhealthy diet, not getting 10K steps a day, not getting good sleep. 20% body fat is something we're going to look at to improve, because everything they're doing is putting them at 20% body fat, and they're not doing anything that's healthy. But you're getting, 7-8 hours of sleep. You track your sleep with your Oura ring, like a madman, and you're not drinking, you're eating healthy, you're getting your 10K steps a day, all of these things, and it puts you at 12% body fat, feeling healthy, like feeling good. And so I think this is a super important thing for people to look at is, what does healthy need to look like for you? Not jacked, lean, and shredded on this, on a photo. So, I mean, what are kind of notions that you run into? I know you work with a different population, but what are some notions that you think people need to be aware of when it comes to what is healthy?
Yeah, well, there is different body types out there. That's reality, right? Like for me at 19% body fat, my resting heart rate's 38, 39 beats per minute. Like every metric in my blood work is like where it should be. Certainly I could be leaner, but not for the sake of my health. It wouldn't make a difference in that regard. So I just naturally kind of store body fat differently than some guys who can actually maintain a six-pack and everything's healthy and their diet doesn't feel overly restricted. Great, good for them. But that's not where I fall, and that's not where everybody falls. And so it's hard to like have one define this is how your body should look to be healthy, even though that's sort of the standards that society has created for us, right? So in terms of your question, sorry to kind of go off on a tangent there, but your question was tied to...
You're elaborating it well. It's just like, what do people really need to consider what healthy is?
I think it's how you feel day to day too, right? So if you wake up with energy, you're not guzzling coffee to get through the day, you have excellent workouts, your joints are in good shape, you sleep well, like all those day-to-day residual benefits of exercise, if you're not getting any of that, then certainly you might be tied to being too lean or too heavy, right? Because there's probably a sweet spot for you to where your body feels its best and is optimized. And if that doesn't quite fit the profile of a man with a six-pack, you got a little bit of belly fat, but you feel great otherwise, then maybe it's okay to strive for that and stay there, right? So yeah, it's not a perfect answer, but I think it's the reality for most of us.
Yeah, it's finding the sweet spot for you. And you talked about this before, and I think more people need to look at it is blood markers, right? You can look at your health, like where are your triglycerides, cholesterol. If you are older, for men, trying to look at your test. And just any like basic fundamental health marker, blood sugars. And from there, you just mentioned all these things, like how do you function day to day? And if you know you're not feeling good about your physique, this is like, it's okay to feel that way. That's okay, because we all do. Like, I mean, I still look at my fitness some days, literally just from the social media effect, right? And there's some days I can feel better about it, but there's many days where, because of that social media effect, where it's like, I feel overweight and I'm not. Like, there's no way I'm actually in an unhealthy body weight, but you reflect on yourself. I always say reflection in the mirror and self-reflection are two different things. The reflection in the mirror is just what it is. My self-reflection is actually just completely a projection of the impact my culture has on me, right? So I'm seeing all my flaws compared to the Jacqueline shredded guy that I just saw yesterday. And the problem is we see these Jacqueline shredded people all the time, because you talk about extremes on social media and algorithm, they're the ones getting all the comments, they're getting all the shares, they're getting all the attention. So you think that's a standard, and it's a very unrealistic standard because it's less than 1% of the population, right? Also, just an asterisk, it's their fucking job. Like, I made a post about that today. Like, when a trainer or fitness influencer is in good shape, give them you got to appreciate that they're paid to be in shape. And it is so much easier for you and I, even for us, to dedicate time, because it's our job to. It's so much harder for you. So just to accept, you might not like something about your fitness. That's okay. Your physique. That's okay. But then you got to reflect on, are you happy with your actions? Because that's what matters. Did you get 10K in? Did you get sleep in? Did you strength train enough throughout the week? And are you at least trying to eat healthy? Like, and eat healthy is a big spectrum. Track calories, maybe that's not for you. Eat predominantly whole foods, right? Whatever your kind of your direction is. And if you look back on your week, it's like, I had healthy behaviors. Then you look back on months of that, you're healthy, right? You should be seeing, and if your goal is weight loss, that's great. Like, I mean, but just know you're still always not going to be a little bit happy with the mirror at times, but it's just like, be proud of your actions. I think that's the healthy behavior we want to instill in people.
Hey man, yeah, it's you versus you at the end of the day, and it's hard to get, well, even as coaches, we get caught up in it because, the influencers online, you have, well, sometimes it's doctored photos, but certainly there's a lot. I don't have to look hard to find someone more jacked than me, right? It's online promoting a fitness coaching program. So I don't compete with them on that, right? I tend to resonate with people who have a lot of weight to lose, because I've done that myself. And our parents, like myself, who have a lot of competing priorities, and I don't want you to put your workouts above your kids or your career, but it should be somewhere in that list, because it's going to benefit all those other things. if you make it enough of a priority. Doesn't have to be the only priority.
Yeah.
So,
That's really the hardest thing, that we know very intuitively because it's our job. And I think this is actually the biggest gap in the system, is that the people who are going to guide you on this, we can't totally relate to what it's like when it's not our job, right? And it's just, that's what we have to deal with, right? We have to deal with this. The best chance, like there's no one that can really fit that profile entirely, right? That can be like, unless you're just getting recommendations from someone who it's not their job, but they're going to tell you how to train and do the nutrition, right? It's not their job to be in shape, but they're going to tell you how to do it. And I actually do recommend people do this. I recommend you find someone in your career that has a similar lifestyle, that has kids and all that stuff. And if you see them training, you see them doing nutrition routinely, just ask them questions. Ask them about their priorities. Ask them how they make that a part of their life, because they will relate to you better than we will. They just simply will. And there's going to be this gap, but this is what I always try to reiterate for the people who are having a hard time. It's like, just so you know, when you do lose that weight and you do make this work, you're a bigger badass than I am, because you didn't have to, you chose to, because it wasn't your job. You took responsibility despite it not being a part of your job. And as you mentioned, Mitch, everything gets better. You do show up better for your family and better for your job. So you will feel better in the end, but we have to sell you on that to make a priority from the beginning of the show, right?
Good old delayed gratification. Yeah, it's the fastest path forward, but it's tough at times, especially if it's not what you do for a living, like you said. But it's so worth it. Your future self will thank you ultimately at the end of the day, right? If you're 70 something and you've been functional throughout your 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, and you're not confined to a walker and personal care home, it's hard to look that far down the road, but the work you do today is going to benefit you down there. So
couldn't agree more. So let's finish off with one quick thing here. Do you have any big ambitions coming down the road?
Big ambitions, not necessarily anything measurable. I always like to have 90-day goals and a North Star to aim for. Certainly continuing to build the business slowly but surely is a focus. Right now, I am tightening things up. I had gotten, for a host of reasons, I gained more weight than I wanted over the last 6, 8, 12 months. No, better part of 8 months, I guess. So I've been pretty dialed in the last 3, 4 weeks. So assuming I can strive towards that 190 number and be better equipped to maintain it this time around by the end of the year.
Love it. I also wanted to highlight this. I forgot to bring this up after one thing you mentioned. Your resting heart rate is 39 beats per minute.
It is, yeah.
That's fucking low. People need to appreciate how low that is. Like, some people would be taking your heart rate, and if it was like a new nurse or something like that, they'd be concerned for your health. But that's actually, that's you got to have a great VO2. Like, that is like elite level. Do you do a lot of zone 2 cardio?
I do. I play hockey. That's kind of my higher intensity stuff. But my steps, half of them I'll get in kind of zone 2 incline walk on a treadmill.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Things.
Yeah.
But VO2 max was 59.
Wow. Yeah, that's elite level. Yeah, that's elite level. That's awesome.
Which I don't do too much for, but cheers.
Yeah, I love it. This is a great chat. I appreciate you fitting in, because I know you're busy. You got a call right away, and we'll touch base. We'll hopefully be getting together in person soon here.
Hopefully one more fishing trip. Yeah, I like it.
I'll make it happen. Okay.
Cheers.
Thanks again to Mitch for that conversation. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. As you could just tell, we bounce back and forth off these ideas. This is how we talk when we're in person, that we just love to really discuss all these different things, and we're on the same level, that it isn't easy to hear that it is simple. It's harder to hear that it's simple. So when you think about something like fasting or the extreme ends of like the carnivore or vegans, it's like people feel like that's the secret and that's what they've been missing. But the missing piece is consistency. And certainly there's going to be other little pieces. Maybe you don't have optimal protein and fiber intake. Maybe you don't go out of your way to meal prep consistently. Maybe that's your missing piece. But no matter what you are missing, it needs to be consistent and over a long period of time, a very long period of time. A lot of people don't realize how long is when you're doing something new. It's super uncomfortable. And that's what we really wanted to highlight. As we had mentioned too, even the simple idea of move more, eat less isn't even enough, right? Because we want to move the right amount, be stronger, and then eat the right amount, right? So there's just the right balance of things. That's why I've never been a big fan of the term moderation, right? Because when you talk about nutrition, and people still use it, I'm not a fan of it because moderation doesn't give you a lot of direction. I believe everything is about balance and balancing, because moderation just kind of paints a very basic brush over things. If someone told you, I did moderately well in school, you'd be like, what? So did you do good? I don't know. Is that like a C average, right? But if you even just say the word balance or balancing, there is an act at place there. And that's super important because that's what you need to do with your lifestyle. That's what you need to do with your nutrition. Everything is balancing. And someone had said this before, and I'll always appreciate it. A true balance never really happens. Really, essentially, my belief is in physics. Like, it's never perfectly balanced. There's just balancing. There's always, even at a microscopic level, there's some variance, and that's okay. And so what you have to appreciate that it's a constant act of adjustment. Your nutrition, your training, your lifestyle, your sleep, it's a constant act. It's not being balanced, it's balancing. It's a constant act of trying to improve. And we mentioned that about our nutrition and training. We're always trying to improve it and having that. So having the notion of constant balance for a long period of time is really what you're going after. We had some really good insight there around like the step count. I think it was good for even me to talk to Mitch about that, because I now will probably apply a little bit more direction to some of my clients and not encourage so many steps. Before I thought it was maybe okay, but now I'm starting to hear that kind of feedback. It kind of makes sense why some clients have been hitting some stalls. So it's important for you to know you don't need to go after that 17, 20K steps. It might not be super helpful. The one thing I'll say as a caveat to that is, let's say you get involved in a step challenge. As currently right now, I have some clients and some other people that are in a step challenge with me, and they just want to go after more steps. The thing I like about that is that you might look for ways to fit in steps more routinely after the challenge. So maybe someone's average right now ends up being like 19K steps, or maybe it's 15K, but they know that's not sustainable. That person will now learn where they got, an extra 1,000 steps here or there. And after the challenge, they shouldn't try to keep up that, but they can keep 10K steps or 8K steps a lot easier, because it's like, well, I can just do this. I can just do this. And that's all you need, because we just want a consistent metabolic output. The problem with stepping is when you're under the 6, when you're around 4 or 5, you're really not going to burn all the calories from your non-exercise, as we mentioned. That's the part where your body is just not going to burn a lot of calories. And it's a huge chunk of your metabolism. So if you can just get that 8 to 10K steps, maybe it's 12, maybe you're feeling good and you actually get a little bit more, whatever it is, as long as it's consistent and it feels good, that's what you're trying to go after. You don't have to feel guilty if you're not getting 15K, 20K steps. There might be less of a bonus long term. So I think that was a super helpful part of the conversation for me personally. And I hope you learned from that. And even the discussion around Ozempic, I think people need to be more open about this. Still cautious, as even Mitch had mentioned. We got to really see what it does to the masses over a long period of time. And if you're not a very obese person, you don't really need to go down that direction. Everyone should need to go through a path or a period where they at least try, very consistent training and nutrition for at least a long period of time. And I'm pretty sure there are qualifications to go through some doctors that way in order to, be qualified for this. And as we mentioned, if you don't have an appetite, then you definitely got to worry about what you're eating, right? So it's even more of a concern of training and nutrition, because you're already not going to take in a lot of calories. So very important that people are open to it, but also still pay attention to things around it. And then the best part of the conversation is what is healthy. And I think Mitch has been really helpful for me from a coach's perspective. And when I first met him, he even talks about it on social media. It's like, I don't need to have a 6-pack abs. Like, I just know I don't. It's not the people I'm serving. It's not the people I'm helping. And it's not sustainable for me. And for him to even say like how much weight he had lost, he got down to like 12% body fat. And that's coming from 20%. That's a huge body composition change, and how much it affected him and negatively. So it's like, is that really healthy? And then if he says that his resting heart rate, I got to reiterate this, we left off on that, a resting heart rate of 39, having a VO2 max near 60, mine was near 60 when I was doing boxing routinely as an athlete. I don't think I'm even close to that now. My resting heart rate, I'm happy, is around 50. And so Mitch is in better aerobic shape than I am. And yeah, he has more body fat. So I go back to the same notion I had on the show that you got to think about is, what are your actions that you're proud of, right? And if you're not training like you feel like you should, that's what you got to look at, is whether or not it's healthy. If you're not doing enough aerobic and you feel like you can actually handle a jog or going up and down a flight of stairs, that's healthy to be able to do. And if you feel like you are over consuming your food and you're not feeling good after your binges or whatever it is, those are the things that really matter. Now, there's going to be body composition ranges, body fat percentage ranges for females. If you are likely, and this is just the probability of what I've seen, is above 30% body fat, you should probably try to get around 20 to 30%. And that range is big because there is a big variance. And if you're under 20% body fat as a female, that's athletic lean. And for males, it's about 10% less. So if you're a male, 20% to 10% is very healthy. And even Mitch is at the top end of that range and very healthy. So as I mentioned, you could be at 20% body fat and not healthy. So it's super important that you look at all the other metrics that go into your health, and if you're going to consider whether or not you're a healthy individual or not, right? So I think that's hopefully helpful and insightful for you to get a bit of a better depiction on what really matters in this whole game, because it's a hard game to play. And I'm going to keep reiterating it. If it's not your job, your responsibility every day, it's really tough to do. And that's okay. That's okay that it's that tough, because that's what's going to make you the bigger badass in the end, better than any other trainer or fitness influencer out there. If you can do it and you just chose to, that's amazing. And you should be proud of that. Thank you so much for listening today. Please feel free to share this with anyone who needs this kind of message. And I really appreciate you as a listener. Please leave a 5-star review if you really valued this episode, if it made a difference for you. And thank you again for listening. I just got to keep saying this every time. I appreciate any listener that I get. And hopefully this little podcast keeps growing, because I'm here to help support you in your own mission, your own ambition, because life is not about the pursuit of happiness, but rather the happiness within your pursuit. And I'll catch you next time.